Our events usually take place on Saturday afternoons, and we have sandwiches, biscuits and tea afterwards, sometimes cake if our pastry cook can make us one. This particular talk was scheduled for April, but of course lockdown interfered with everything, so thanks to technology and some very clever people at Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution, we are able to present it tonight. It is being recorded, so can be accessed via our website at any time, as can all the other events that have taken place or are scheduled for the coming weeks. As I'm sure you all realise, institutions like ours, along with museums and other cultural centres, are doing everything they can to continue to provide education and entertainment to their public during this exceptionally difficult time. Lockdown has meant empty coffers for all of us. So although this is a free event, we hope, if you haven't already been kind enough to make a donation, and I know many of you have already done so, you might be able to make a small contribution to enable us to remain a valuable source for enlightenment in all its many guises when we are finally allowed to open our doors again. Our speaker tonight is Sabine Purshouse, whose interest in Jane Austen began at university in Hanover. She then came to the United Kingdom and found herself becoming more involved with Jane Austen's period while doing her master's in bonnie Scotland at Glasgow University. She speaks several languages and has taught in Germany, Scotland and England. Her love of history has continued, and she especially likes researching and presenting what she discovers in a way that will engage her audience. This method of giving a talk is new to many of us, so we're very grateful to Sabine for embracing the technology that allows us to hear and see her tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome your speaker, Sabine Purshouse.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction, Diana. It is a huge privilege for me to share my findings on marriage matters in Georgian time through this very new medium. So many thanks to Diana and Andreas at the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution who made this possible. Jane Austen's novels all end with the knot neatly tied. In each of them, the heroine has found Mr. Right, and they live happily ever after. So, they are often trivialized as Cinderella stories. Ironically, of course, Jane Austen herself was never married, although she's known to have had romantic encounters and a marriage proposal, which she turned down. Her novels, however, reveal her as a keen observer of courtship rituals and the married state in a variety of forms. Rather than being sentimental, the novels show Jane Austen's acute awareness that in Georgian times, whether people, particularly women, married or not, made a huge difference to their lives. Marriage still matters today, of course. In Britain, about 50% of the adult population is either married or in a civil partnership, with another 15% who have been married at some time before. Some researchers believe these percentages have not changed very much in the past 500 years. What has changed is the thinking about why people marry, about the roles of men and women in a marriage, and, above all, the laws governing marriage. These changes evolved in the public debate, particularly in the course of the 18th and early 19th century, from the Age of Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, to the Romantic era. This debate took place in the new social media of a proliferation of printed matter. It came in the form of pamphlets, newspapers, magazines, and novels, with contributions by both men and women. At the same time, the emerging trend in thinking stood in sharp contrast to the laws concerning marriage. These laws sought to preserve the existing status quo, which particularly disadvantaged married women for more than another 150 years. In this talk, I want to look at, first of all, the Georgian public debate on aspects of marriage, then how the new thinking on marriage is reflected in Jane Austen's novels, and then on some laws concerning marriage referred to in the novels. Let us start with 6 quotes of referring to marriage by famous people of the time. How about this one? I believe marriages would in general be as happy, and often more so, if they were all made by the Lord Chancellor, upon a due consideration of characters and circumstances, without the parties having any choice in the matter. Samuel Johnson is being cynical, of course, but marriage was widely thought of in pragmatic terms. In the upper tiers of society, it was there to consolidate or increase the wealth and influence of families, with the expectation of offspring to maintain bloodlines. The views of the bride and groom were insignificant. Daniel Defoe reminds us of the powerful force bringing 2 people together, as described in literature since time immemorial, from ancient Greek dramas to Shakespeare's plays. That is love. He says, there is a trifle not much thought of in modern marriages called love, as early as 1704. In the age of reason, people struggled to fit human emotions into an image of themselves as rational creatures. Feelings seemed to upset their sense of order in society. But from the late 18th century onwards, through Romanticism came to value genuine personal feelings as natural. That way, love also became a desirable basis for marriage. The basic idea of all men having certain freedoms expressed by John Locke about 100 years earlier was promoted from the second half of the 18th century by philosophers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Individual choice of what people could do with their lives became an accepted view. Here, it is expressed in the preamble to the American Constitution. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In this spirit, young people increasingly demanded the freedom to choose their marriage partners. There was, however, an inconsistency in the focus on individual happiness, as Mary Astor pointed out in her Reflections on Marriage, as early again as 1704. If all men are born free, she says, how is it that all women are born slaves? She is referring to the fact that under common law, traditionally, in legal terms, a woman ceased to exist during marriage under a concept called coverture. In the late 18th century, women began to question this, particularly, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft. Jane Austen is likely to have been aware of both writers. However, women came up against a very powerful systemic gender inequality at the time. They were indoctrinated with beliefs like this one, expressed by Lord Halifax in his advice manual for girls. He basically says, get used to it, girls. There is inequality in the sexes, and that for the better economy of the world, the men, who were to be the lawgivers, had the larger share of reason bestowed upon them, by which means your sex is the better prepared for the compliance that is necessary for the better performance of those duties which seem the most properly assigned to it. The ideas of women being compliant and performing duties were perpetuated in the sermons by the Reverend Fordyce of 1766, which Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice reads to the Bennet girls. They don't like it particularly. I believe that Mr. Collins's proposal speech to Elizabeth was no doubt also inspired by the Reverend Fordyce. Hester Chapon, I hope that's the correct pronunciation, a member of the famous Blue Stocking Circle, made this demand for her for the relationship between husband and wife in her matrimonial creed. I believe it absolutely necessary to conjugal happiness that the husband have such an opinion of his wife's understanding, principles, and integrity of heart as would induce him to exalt her to the rank of his first and dearest friend. It still sounds a far cry from the accepted norm today, but Jane Austen would have thought this idea of a companionate marriage a step in the right direction. So in the Georgian era then, that was a time of fundamental change in the way people thought about themselves, about their relationship to family and their place in society. With regards to marriage, the thinking changed on these 4 questions. Who decides which 2 people get married? Family elders or the marriage partners, the partners-to-be themselves? What are the importance of social status and wealth? What are the roles of physical attraction and romantic love? And what were the roles of husbands and wives in a marriage? Let us look at how the shift in thinking about marriage in the Georgian era is reflected in Jane Austen's novels on these 4 questions. Well, who decides which 2 people get married? Jane Austen presents arranged marriages as belonging to a past age and to the upper classes. The respectable young man in her novels, like Mr. Darcy here, courts the object of his heart's desire, proposes to her, and once she has accepted him, he goes to her father to request her hand in marriage. Mr. Bingley, Mr. Darcy, Henry Tilney, and even Captain Wentworth are all seen to follow this rule. As a modern feature, the lady in question claims the right of refusal. Contemporary readers of Pride and Prejudice would have been shocked when Elizabeth turns down not just 1, but 2 marriage proposals because there was neither love nor respect. Jane Austen's novels are asserting a woman's right to only accept a marriage proposal that she feels that she can live with. In her lifetime, that was still widely considered revolutionary. Only aristocratic figures still hold the view that marriages should be arranged by family elders. In Pride and Prejudice, Lady Catherine de Bourgh believes that her nephew, Mr. Darcy, should marry her daughter, as agreed with his mother long ago. However, Mr. Darcy is a modern man and has made up his own mind. Social status and wealth mattered a great deal in Jane Austen's novels. At first glance, Jane Austen's characters come from the upper tiers of society, one step below the aristocracy. At the top of the social hierarchy are Sir Thomas Bertram and class-obsessed Sir Walter Elliot, who are baronets with titles, fortunes, and estates. Mr. Darcy, Mr. Knightley, and Mr. Bennet have no title and estates of various sizes. Heritage, though, we learn, can be vulnerable. An estate requires skillful management. If the incumbent does not look after the finances, he can end up like Sir Walter Elliot, who has to rent out his estate to Admiral Croft. An estate can also be entailed to male heirs, as is the case for Sir Walter, Mr. Bennet, and Mr. Dashwood. And they do not have sons, and on their death, their wives and daughters would become homeless, as the Dashwood ladies do in Sense and Sensibility. Class distinctions were a complex affair. Under the custom of primogeniture, only the eldest son inherited title and estate, and only few heroines in Jane Austen's novels marry one of those. Most get married to a younger son. Younger sons had money invested in professional training to allow them to earn a living, typically as lawyers, like Mr. John Knightley, clergymen, like Edmund Bertram and Henry Tilney, in the army, like Colonel Fitzwilliam, who explains to Elizabeth he's not in the marriage market for that particular reason, or in the navy, like Captain Wentworth. They were effectively downwardly mobile, which affected their marriage chances. On the other hand, there were the upwardly mobile in the 18th century, the successful merchants, like the uncle in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Gardiner, and owners of factories and coal mines, like the father of Mr. Bingley. Their sons and daughters would be well educated and inherit fortunes. They would mix socially with the sons and daughters of property-owning families at balls and other places of leisure and pleasure, particularly in Bath. Thus, the offspring of these nouveau riches became attractive as husbands and wives for the heirs of land and title to help maintain the family heritage. That is why Mr. Bingley is such a catch. The situation for women of the gentry and of the professional classes was much harsher. Let's consider Mansfield Park, which begins with a tale of three sisters with a handsome dowry. The beautiful one married a baronet and became financially well settled. The eldest married an elderly clergyman, was widowed, and became dependent on her brother-in-law's charity. And the youngest fell for an unambitious naval lieutenant, against her family advice, of course, and finished up in poverty. None of these marriages are particularly happy ones. Yet, being married was still preferable to remaining a spinster, like poor Miss Bates in Emma, poor and laughed at, as one sister tells another in the Watsons. It is important to note that the heroines in Jane Austen's novels all end up marrying appropriately within their class, yet slightly above their family status. He is a gentleman, I am a gentleman's daughter. So far we are equal, Elizabeth Bennet famously tells Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who suggested that she was of inferior birth. Physical attraction and romantic love versus economic status are hotly debated in Jane Austen's novels. The ideal marriage here is based in mutual love and respect as well as in financial security. There are only very few such model marriages, though. The Gardiners in Pride and Prejudice, perhaps, and Admiral and Mrs. Croft in Persuasion. According to Jane Austen, to achieve true happiness in marriage, there has to be a balance between spontaneous emotional response and practical common sense. That is the lesson Marianne Dashwood in Sense and Sensibility learns, who we see here on the screen. Like many young girls at age 17, she believes in love at first sight forever. But she falls for the disreputable Willoughby, who abandons her and, as he has already done to another girl, to marry for money in the end. Be careful who you lose your heart to, girls, is the clear message. Romantic love is an essential requisite for the young men who eventually become the husbands of the heroines, though. Their passions, however, is always combined with an appreciation of the girl's intelligence and moral integrity. So even the outwardly calm Mr. Darcy quite early on finds Elizabeth's face rendered uncommonly intelligent by the beautiful expression of her dark eyes. Fortune huntresses like Mary Crawford, Lucy Steele, and Isabella Thorpe are portrayed as nasty. However, even Marianne Dashwood has to concede that her ideal marriage is founded on an income of about £2,000 a year, clearly expecting a very comfortable lifestyle. She succeeds in the end, with a husband who loves her and whom she learns to love, as you can see in the second picture. By contrast, Charlotte Lucas in Pride and Prejudice is faced with remaining on the shelf at age 28, and when the opportunity arises, she marries Mr. Collins, recently rejected by Elizabeth. "I am not romantic," she says. "I ask only for a comfortable home." And for that, she puts up with quite a lot. Jane Austen maybe says here that not every girl is lucky enough to love and be loved by a Mr. Darcy with a handsome estate and a stunning annual income of £10,000. The roles of husband and wives in Jane Austen's novels follow the conventional division of labour along gender lines. He is in charge of the estate or has a profession. She is in charge of the home. The details of the wives' roles, though, depend on the joint income, and Jane Austen provides exact sums for all the leading characters, so we can deduce some of the aspects of these roles. Marianne Dashwood, with all her notions of romantic love, still aspires to a proper establishment of servants. That is a significant help in the household. A carriage, perhaps two, she adds. Fortunately, Colonel Brandon has the necessary annual income of the £2,000, combined with a nice house and an estate. The Bennets live on the same income level, and so we get some insight into the wife's role when Mrs. Bennet informs Mr. Collins that they were well able to afford a good cook and that her daughters had nothing to do in the kitchen. So we know that Mrs. Bennet's job is just to discuss dinners and other household matters with the cook, who may be also in part a housekeeper. Mrs. Bennet does not need to cook herself, and nor do her daughters. It was Mr. Collins who asked about this particular issue, and we infer from his question that Charlotte Lucas is expected to be a lot more hands-on in the running of the household of her clergyman husband. Their annual income may be up to about £1,000, similar to that of the other heroines who marry clergymen, that is, Eleanor Dashwood, Fanny Price, and Catherine Morland. They will have a smaller number of servants to manage the home, so they will be a lot more involved than Mrs. Bennet. Lower down the social scale, Fanny Price's parents have about £400 to live on, with a large family. That apparently only allows for a small house in Portsmouth and 2 bad servants who are slovenly and produce disgusting meals. Mrs. Price seems to be struggling to keep her household in order. Elizabeth Bennet, on the other hand, will be a lady of leisure on £10,000 a year. Pemberley has an experienced housekeeper who manages a large staff, and Elizabeth will only just need to occasionally confer with her. Mr. Darcy has an estate manager, but we are told that he meets with him regularly and keeps a close eye on the running of his vast estate. And we get the impression that Mr. Darcy and Elizabeth will keep each other well informed of what goes on. Altogether then, Jane Austen's novels reflect the new trend for marriages based in mutual love and respect, and for individual choice of marriage partner. But they are pragmatic in terms of financial considerations. Let us now consider the laws governing marriage, within which the characters of her novels had to operate. In the course of the 18th century, the number of wealthy people increased dramatically. Therefore, many more people had fortunes and land to pass on to their offspring, who could then become easy prey for fortune hunters. And they are referred to in Jane Austen's novels, of course. As a result, there was almost a counter-movement to the liberal ideas on marrying for love. New acts of Parliament and legal advice literature concerning marriage were designed to uphold what was thought of as the old order. They basically aimed to protect the status of the property-owning ruling classes. These marriage laws particularly set women at a disadvantage. Let's have a look at the legal landscape with regards to marriage. Getting married had been relatively easy until the middle of the 18th century. It just required a clergyman to whom one paid a fee, and this could be in all sorts of different places. Wealthy parents became increasingly concerned by the number of clandestine marriages. Fleet marriages were particularly notorious. Apparently, the area around the Fleet prison in London developed into a popular market for marriages on the quick. Eventually, Parliament was involved, and after a period of apparently very lively debate, the first statutory framework for marriage was passed in 1753, now known as Lord Hardwicke's Marriage Act. And you can see its title tells you what the function it serves. It is an act for the better preventing of clandestine marriages. And this is what it stipulates. You can read this online, by the way, if you have the patience. A marriage has to be performed in a Church of England, which is, of course, discriminating against other religions, but there you go. The ceremony has to be conducted by a Church of England clergyman. Banns have to be read 3 Sundays beforehand. Parental permission is required for all under 21, and records have to be kept by both married partners and by 2 credible witnesses, in inverted commas, which suggests that the term was maybe flexible. And the interesting thing about this is that most of this is still valid, except, of course, laws have been passed that other religions couldn't deal with marriage as they see fit, and now no longer parental permission is required for anyone, well, under 16 really, or 18 is the marriage age. Those wanting to marry in a hurry, there were only two options open. You could either go to Gretna Green on a coach and horses, and that is one of the big worries when Lydia is getting too close to Mr. Wickham, that they might do that. Or you could go and marry by license, which you obtained from a bishop or a surrogate. And that is what Mr. Darcy arranges for Lydia to be married to Mr. Wickham. They married in the insignificant little church of St. Clement's because Wickham's lodgings were in that parish. And this implies that he had been resident there for at least 3 weeks, so that bans could be read. Now, at the same time that marriage became more formalized, the legal advice literature on the roles of husband and wife basically restated what had been common law for centuries. So here is the legal advice work, The Laws Respecting Women, by Mr. William Blackstone, published between 1765 and 69. And this is an excerpt from it. By marriage, the very legal existence of a woman is suspended, or at least it is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. So husband and wife basically became one person, that of the husband. This concept came with obligations for the husband to provide for his wife and the offspring, and the expectations that he would act for his wife. Conversely, that meant that the wife could not sue, could not be sued, could not sign a contract, and could not make a valid will. Moreover, all her property became his. And it gets worse still. Common law also gave the husband the role of disciplinarian. So even in William Blackstone in the middle of the 18th century, it's restated that the husband also, by the old law, might give his wife moderate correction, in the same moderation that a man is allowed to correct his apprentices or children. We can now see Jane Austen's demand for respect from husbands for their wives was almost an understatement. Ahead of the wedding, some serious and often lengthy negotiations of the settlement took place. The marriage settlement was a legally binding document, and it specified 3 aspects. First of all, it stated the wife's portion, which was the amount of money and property which she brought into the marriage. With these portions, or dowries as we call them now, there was a going rate depending on the social status of the bride. So obtaining a wife with a handsome portion might have been an easy way to get rich quick for men like Mr. Wickham or Mr. Willoughby. The marriage settlement was also defined the wife's allowance, or pin money as it is sometimes called. Most importantly, though, it would specify her jointure. And that was important in the absence of widows' pensions. An estimated 45% of wives became widows, so they had to consider this case from the outset. Now, in addition to all these arrangements in the marriage settlement, it was also possible to protect some of the wife's property. Remember, everything else was part of the husband, but you could protect some of the wife's property through what was known as a separate estate. And this, in principle, could not be touched by the husband. So the separate estate might be a piece of land or a sum of money invested with some annual interest being paid. And apparently advice by women, for women, so aunts and grandmothers even, and good friends, would advise young brides to make this, take this extra legal protection. In Pride and Prejudice, where Mr. Darcy and Mr. Gardiner negotiate the marriage settlement with Mr. Wickham, we find that they do that on behalf of Mr. Bennet, who's the father, obviously, but is not present. Lydia's portion, we find out, consists of £100 per annum, according to that, as a contribution to the couple's income. And then we find out that Lydia is also due her share of the £5,000 that Mr. Bennet has settled on his children after his death. So she would get £1,000 out of that in annual interest, which would mean it's calculated at about 5%. So that would add another £50 per annum to the contribution that she makes. So she, in all, she would contribute, after Mr. Bennet's death, £150. To secure Mr. Wickham's income, Mr. Darcy arranges for him to have an ensigncy conveniently far away in the north. He also arranges for Lydia's jointure, but we are not given any indication of what sum of money was involved for that. So here we have in Pride and Prejudice a good example of the arrangement of a marriage settlement. But what, sorry, I'll go back to this one because I found an example. This was a document that seems to have appeared in an auction a number of years ago and gives you an example of what a marriage settlement actually looks like as a document, which I thought was quite interesting. Nobody that I would know about, but it was a document from 1783, which I thought was quite interesting to see. Here I found a humorous little quote by Daniel Defoe, and the picture from Hogarth's Marriage à la Mode from 1743, covering a similar kind of circumstance. So what if there were problems in the marriage? Well, people were well advised to heed the old saying, marry in haste, repent at leisure. The Church of England did not provide for divorce, in spite of Henry VIII's life choices. Divorce only became legally more available in 1857. Excuse me. Very few wealthy people were granted a divorce by Act of Parliament. Otherwise, we have an example in Mansfield Park where Mr. Rushworth had married Maria Bertram, and of course Maria was found in with Henry Crawford carrying on, and so he had grounds for divorcing her. Marriage problems were covered by bodies of the law that existed beside the common law. So the common law allowed only for divorce by Act of Parliament, but there was also equity law or chancery, which dealt with property rights. A case that I can think of is the Eleanor Mary Bowes of the Countess of Strathmore, who had to resort to this court in order to protect some of her property from a husband. And then there was ecclesiastical law, which dealt with probate and with marriage breakdown. And there are studies on court records on happening in ecclesiastical law courts at different levels in different parts of the country. Even if you won your case, the best thing that could happen was you could have a separation allowed. Remarriage was not allowed, and for a separation, for the woman, the added problem was that she lost her jointure, she lost her portion, which was not repaid. So a divorced woman often ended up destitute and dependent on charity by the parish. The divorced Maria Bertram in Mansfield Park was to go and live with the horrible Aunt Norris, and she was then, of course, shunned by society. Being left widowed was a common experience, with infectious diseases still widespread and limited cures for any illnesses. Many people remarried, some more than once, which made for lots of hybrid families. The Dashwood family in Sense and Sensibility is a case in point. If the husband died, the wife became the executrix. Ecclesiastical law entitled her to 1/3 of her husband's movables. That's the value of anything movable rather than the estate and the house. And that was after debts had been paid. That was very harsh. So the importance of a separate estate becomes really clear at this point. The wife's jointure, the modern-day widow's pension, would be calculated from her portion. That's the money and value of property which she had brought into the marriage. The legally accepted ratio of the portion to jointure was 10:1. So she got an annuity of 10% of her portion. So it depended very much on how long the wife survived, whether she had got as much or less out of the portion that she had paid in. She was, in either case, not likely to be a merry widow or a catch. A widower, on the other hand, would keep the entire joint wealth. That does not mean the bereavement wasn't a loss. A diary entry of a man with a large number of young children whose wife recently died speaks of despair. All's at an end. How was he to manage a household, the staff, and the care of the children, as well as the job that provided the family income? The most economical answer was to remarry. There was a slim silver lining to the cloud that marriage could easily become for women in Georgian times. Common perception of marriage was that of husband and wife pooling and sharing resources. It was seen as a division of labor for the common good of the family. On marriage, the wife took on the management of the household, which was a substantial role and therefore carried status. And you can see there was a lot of advice literature for housekeepers and housewives around, and you can see a little insight into a Georgian kitchen there. Prudence and economy were, of course, important qualities looked for in a wife. Literacy and numeracy were usually very highly valued because the wife was typically expected to keep the accounts. I think that would not have been the case for maybe those on a £2,000 per annum income, but anyone below that would have had to do that. And many a business, of course, relied on the wife's skills, and military men who had to be abroad for long spells of time depended very much on their wives. Although I'm not quite sure how good Lydia would have been at this. Significantly, the wife was in charge of the procurement of necessaries, and they had to be according to the husband's rank and wealth. Being legally a femme couverte, of course, implied that she acted as her husband's agent in terms of another little legal device under common law at the time, and that was the law of agency. So, when she made purchases of food supplies, household goods, and even furnishing and furniture, she did so as her husband's agent. In the invoice register, of course, of the time, it is usually the husband's name that appears, but shrewd businessmen address their marketing efforts, of course, at the wives. Now, the husbands were then also liable if their wives incurred debts. Wives, remember, could not be sued. The only legal redress a man then apparently had was to publish an advertisement in a local paper or even in a local shop to the effect that any tradesman doing business with his wife could not be paid by him. Viewed against a legal framework so hostile to women, Jane Austen's achievement takes on a different dimension, I think. Her work is not revolutionary in the way that Mary Wollstonecraft's was, but her novels aren't just romantic chick flicks either. They encouraged young women to take an active part in the decision process for or against a marriage. They encouraged them to marry with their hearts, but to keep their heads switched on. They encouraged them to be bold and to demand to be respected by their future husbands for their intelligence and for their moral integrity. After all, Jane Austen would agree with Mrs. Randolph, who wrote, "A woman's happiness depends entirely on the husband she is united to." Having considered public opinions and contemporary law on marriage in Georgian times, this makes sense. Jane Austen would, however, have added, I believe, "A man's happiness depends on the wife he is united to in almost equal measure." Thank you very much.